So I'm Megan. I am performing double duty tonight because not only am I here moderating, for those of you who don't know me, I also run the whole festival. So yeah, I didn't have enough to do today, so I thought I'd moderate a panel. So one of the things we do, and I'm not going to tell you like all about Words and Music, I'm not going to tell you about the organization that runs it, One Book, One New Orleans, because I don't want to eat into our time. But I will say that we love supporting local independent booksellers. So we have two that we are working with this festival. Number one, right outside, Tubby and Koo's Traveling Bookshop. Anything you see during the entire Words and Music Festival, if someone's on a stage, their book is over there at Tubby and Koo's, you can walk right over there, buy it, and I am sure I speak for the authors when I say they will sign it. Yes, okay. But we also have to realize that we are right next door to the oldest Black-owned bookstore in New Orleans, Community Book Center. And we want to make sure that we're also supporting them and their presence on Bayou Road. So we are at every session doing a little drawing for folks who RSVP'd for a $25 Community Book Center gift card. And our randomizer, for those of you who RSVP'd, chose Jana Ward. Is Jana here? Our randomizer picked an alternate. How about Travis Lux? All right, if either Jana or Travis rolls up, we will give them a gift card. Otherwise, more for the next session. We might give away two then. Okay, so I think I'm gonna open this discussion by telling as brief a story as I can. And I'm gonna tell this story and then segue into the first question. So this was probably 2015. And I was reading a letter from a woman who was incarcerated in Florida. And she writes, "Send the largest and most difficult books you can. I'm not kidding. James Joyce's Ulysses is not too difficult for me. I have a PhD in English. I was a college English professor before I got incarcerated for DUI manslaughter." And I read this and I'm looking at it, and I also have a PhD in English. And at the time I was teaching English at the university level. And if I'm being brutally honest, I have twice in my life gotten behind the wheel when I had no business being there. And by a stroke of luck, I didn't harm anybody or myself. And so it's one thing to know in your head that there are people locked up just like you who made the same life choices and the same mistakes that you have. And it's another thing entirely to hold the tangible proof of that knowledge in your hand. And that's the letter, out of all the letters I've read while volunteering with Louisiana Books to prisoners, that really deepened my love and appreciation for the work and made me want to do more. And so I wanted to share that because I told Mac and Kelly I was going to ask them, what's your most memorable letter that sort of sticks out with you and that you carry with you?
Well, I promise we didn't rehearse this, but the one I was going to talk about was somebody who asked for the biggest book. So I'll segue into a different, into one it's a type of letter that always causes a conundrum, or at least makes many volunteers in prison book programs pause. And that is the idea, when you get a letter and someone's asking for Norse mythology, or they're asking for Mein Kampf, or they're asking for something that may indicate that they are a white supremacist in prison. And the conundrum is always, right, you don't know exactly why that person is requesting that letter. You're requesting that particular genre of books. You're making an assumption. And then it's also the idea that you can change people's minds, and books do open that door. And so there were some people who would just send, and we would never answer those letters with, obviously we would never send Mein Kampf into prison, But I always took the route of sending something that I was hoping would allow them to see. I would send them Malcolm X Speaks to Young People, or I would send them a book about Martin Luther King. I would try to send them something that I hope that maybe they might read because they had limited reading options, and that it may open doors for them, right? And there were other people in the programs who didn't want to. They thought that was wasting those books, because sometimes these books are precious resources to us because we often don't have the funding that we need to have all of those books on hand, right? And so it's the idea that if you're sending that book to someone who's potentially a white supremacist, that they wouldn't be reading it, and that you would be, by sending that out, you would be keeping it from the hands of somebody else who may desperately want that book. And those are some of the struggles that you have to, some of the choices that you have to make. And then there's other letters that I think that really kind of always struck home, and for me it was always the people on death row. When you got a letter from someone who was on death row, I would just make it a point to get them whatever they asked for, however I could, right? Because that person, you know, they're writing you, and they understand their situation, and they're explaining to you how their life is on the inside, and they're asking you for this one thing. There's not many things left that someone can give them, right? But that was one. And so I would go, and even if I had to buy it personally from a bookstore, I would go and I would answer those letters. So, if you have other similar experiences?
Yeah, I think similarly to kind of both of you, the letters that come to mind right now are the ones that just like have stopped me in my tracks. When I first started doing this work, seeing the first letters that I ever saw that people wrote, asking for books, were just so eye-opening, just hearing so many different experiences and so many different perspectives about what life is like for folks who are locked up, and seeing connections of, oh my gosh, we like the same kinds of books. Ooh, I love this one based on what this person asked for. I bet they're gonna love it too, you know. And those can just be really beautiful and eye-opening. And also, there are the kinds of books that sort of take the breath out of you. You know, like for me, a similar one was, I realized it was someone that I knew that I didn't know was locked up until I got the letter. And so, yeah, it's just the variety of experiences and of voices makes an impact.
Absolutely. I'm going to walk us back just a hair because I forgot to introduce the panelists. Kelli Gann is an educator at Morris Jeff and is a member of the Louisiana Books to Prisoners Collective. And Marquis is a postdoc in North Carolina?
University of Nevada, Reno.
University of Nevada, Reno. Has that changed recently?
It has.
Okay. See, I memorized his bio when he moved. And has co-authored this beautiful book, Books Through Bars, Stories from the Prison Books Movement. So, my goal at this point was to walk us back anyway, because we're sitting here, the three of us, having done some of this. And we're talking like everyone in the audience knows what we're talking about when we say read letters. And I realize that might not be the case for everyone. So can we walk us back a little bit and talk about what a typical work night might look like in the prison books movement?
Sure. And I also want to just, first of all, thank One Book, One New Orleans, and Meg for hosting us and bringing us together. We really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. And when we're talking about answering letters, many of us, most of the people in the book, volunteer for what we call prison books programs. And the general idea of prison books programs is that we receive letters from incarcerated people and we send them free books. I mean, that's the simple, fast, down and dirty idea. But the reality is that there's between 50 and 60, it fluctuates, of these organizations scattered throughout the country. We're all individual organizations. There's no overarching organization or umbrella that we operate under. We're loosely confederated, as it were. And we communicate with one another and kind of help each other out as best we can when the opportunity arises to do so. And most of these programs are volunteer run. And I'm curious if I can see out there, how many people knew that there was such a program in New Orleans? All right, good crowd, good crowd. Let's give a crowd a hand. All right. Not every state has one, and these programs, like I said, are generally all volunteer. And these programs, although a couple of them do now have some staff. But that said, that is what we do as prison books programs. That's the nuts and bolts of it. There's lots of obstacles you might imagine that we face in getting books inside, right, to the population that is designed to be forgotten. And I think that one of the things for us in that when we talk about what does a typical work night look like, it really depends upon the program, and that's really what is one of the things that's beautiful about the prison book social movement, is that these programs, they look very different depending upon where you go. Some may be run out of an individual's garage, and with just a few books and a small library. Others have their own spaces. Some have been in operation since the 1970s, which is one of the things that after I wrote the book, I kind of began to think about it a little more after I helped co-edit the book. I began to think about it a little more, and I realized that these programs began their existence right around the same time as the Attica prison rebellion. And it dawned on me that there's likely a connection there, although the hard part is that there's not the people who started these programs, because there was no documentation, we haven't really been able to ascertain these things, which is part of why we wrote the book, because we don't want the histories that we can piece together so far to be lost, as the other previous histories have been lost in terms of the origins of the programs. So it really depends upon each particular program. I know one of the programs I volunteered the most with was Asheville Prison Books, and those, depending upon the space that we had, and we had to move spaces multiple times due to funding, but depending upon the space that we had, really kind of dictated what a typical volunteer evening would look like. Some of the fun ones were when we were doing benefits, right? We would have big productions. We might have a cover band night on Halloween, right? Those were big, huge parties, and they were a lot of fun. And everybody liked to volunteer and participate on those nights. And then other times, you might come into the prison books workroom, and people would be cranking tunes on the boombox, and we're all just chit-chatting and having a good time, packaging things up. And it may sound odd to say that we were having a good time when doing this work, because you're dealing with these letters and it can get really heavy at times. And that certainly happened, no doubt about it. But also we try to bring joy to it where we can, right? So it really runs the gamut depending upon the program. You want to talk about what it's like in your program?
Yeah, so I've been volunteering with Louisiana Books for Prisoners since 2016, and just even in that amount of time, we've kind of run the gamut, like you said, of being in someone's garage, having our own space, all kinds of different things. So right this very second, the way a typical volunteer shift works is, we open letters, we see what people want to read, and then we have a small library of donated books, and based on what people say they want to read, we pull books that match that, we wrap them up, and we mail them to people. And we also kind of have a cool little program, speaking of like the scrappiness of different groups. Another group in another state created a database where we can check and see if someone has gotten a package from another group, and if what books they've read, so that we can kind of help continue. So for example, if someone got the first 2 books in a series, you could be like, oh, let's make sure and send you that finale, so you're not left hanging. So yeah, but like you said, it can be heavy. It can also just be from.
So I'm glad you brought up the fact that you guys are sort of piecing together the histories that you can. Because when I read the origin stories section of this book, I thought about a conversation. The three of us sat down, and I think it was March or April, and started talking about the way that all of these programs came about. And it really was like the Bible, like so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat that boy. And it really felt like Asheville begat Big House, which begat Louisiana Books to Prisoners, which begat the work of what New Orleans is doing. Can y'all talk a little bit about those connections, what you can piece together?
Sure. So I've continued to try to piece those connections together. And when I first got involved, it was in Asheville, North Carolina, and I'd done previous work for political prisoner support in New Jersey at the time, and most of that was done through the Advocates of Black Cross. And then, kind of as time went on, my interests expanded. And then when I ended up in Asheville, there were 2 women there who were starting the Prison Books program, and I helped get that program running. And at the time, this was about 1998 or 99, and there was no Prison Books program in the South. We were the first one. And so we naively thought, well, we'll just take care of the South. How hard will that be? And we didn't know, and I'm glad we didn't know, right? Because, then we probably would have been scared, right? But we didn't know. And so we decided that we would take care of the entire South, and then that quickly was very, very daunting. But we had lots of people coming through town, and then, what happened was that people came through town from Florida, and they started, the one in Pensacola, and then people left Asheville who had been a part of the program, started another program in North Carolina, and then another program branched off of that, and then people from those programs went on a tour, and take it from there.
So when I first started doing this work, similar to you, it was very much by accident. I went to a puppet show in Jackson, Mississippi, where I'm from, and a traveling group called the Mysterious Rabbit Puppet Army, based out of Durham, North Carolina, was doing a puppet show called What Are Prisons For? And at the end of this puppet show, they said, we're a prison books group. They explained what that meant, and then they said, we've been trying to fulfill these book requests from all over the country, and we have this huge stack of letters from Mississippi, and there's no prison books group in Mississippi. So we would love it if any locals wanna, take these letters off our hands and send some folks some books. So I and a few other people, also very naively, gave them our email addresses, and they said, let us know when you're ready for the letters. And so we told them we were ready, and they sent us this box like this big, full of 600 letters, and we were just like, what have we done? And so that's how the Mississippi group started. As the Mississippi group was starting, we had no idea what we were doing, and so we found out there was a group in New Orleans, and so we took a big field trip down here, and volunteered at one of the work shifts and got a lot of that expertise too. So we were kind of begotten from Durham, but raised by Louisiana. And so then when I moved here, I was like, well, I'll just keep volunteering in Louisiana since they taught me everything I know.
And I'll say this, that, right, it may sound odd how that happens, but that is the story of many programs, is that you contact another program, or you get on the listserv and you say that you're starting up a program, and you ask for overflow letters, and all the other programs send you whatever it is that you asked for, right? So in that way, we are a cooperative bunch in that manner, right? We're always looking to help one another, always looking to assist one another on these programs, even though there's no formal structure. And then when you read that first letter, when you answer your first letter, oftentimes you're just hooked right from there, right? Because you know that that person is counting on you, and they have so few resources to acquire what it is that they want, and they're asking for a book, right? And that book opens so many doors to someone. Just think about, and I don't know how it is for everybody else, but I put myself in that position, right? Of if I was incarcerated, what would that look like for me? Like, how important would a book be for me? And it seems unfathomable, right? But it's difficult to acquire those books. And many people on the inside never get a book. They never get it. They don't even get letters, right? There's often people who are just forgotten. And that contact goes away after years. Maybe they haven't even gotten a letter in years. So when you're able to send them a book, it just reminds them, so who cares? Right? That they're not forgotten, they exist. It matters. And so it's like I mean, we're in a church or a former church, so that's like a sacred duty in a way, right? When you get that letter, it's like you have to answer it, you have to answer that.
Yeah, I was just doing book club inside the Orleans Parish Jail a couple weeks ago, and a man told me he'd been there for 10 months and nobody come to see him. And he was like, thank you so much for being here with this book for me. And I brought the author in and he got it signed. And you could just tell, like you're saying, that that really meant something to be able to do that, to be able to provide that service. And it does take so much, but also so little to just make someone's day, you know? And I want to read from page 33, I just want to read 2 sentences to sort of go into the next question, which piggybacks on something that you brought up, Meg. And this is from Prison Books, A Lifeline by Victoria Law, her chapter. Victoria points out that there is no national mandate requiring jails and prisons to have a library or provide meaningful access to books. In fact, there is no mandate requiring them to provide any access to reading materials at all. So these groups are really necessary because they're doing the work that is not legally mandated, right? Because you're there where there should be someone who is saying, yes, this is necessary, but there isn't. So I wanted to talk about, the fact there's no national mandate, there's no way to know what facility allows what in, there's no mandate, there's basically no blueprint, ever. So could y'all talk about some of the rules and regulations you see, since there are no guidelines, that sort of are sent to you by individual facilities? Because since there aren't any guidelines and no rules and no regulations, every facility in the United States gets to make their own rules about what books they allow in. Could y'all talk a little bit about some of the rules you've seen?
No. There's so many to choose from.
I was going to give a broad overview. And
That's a good idea.
So keep in mind, when we're talking about the carceral state, that there's multiple tiers, right? It's not, you have federal, state, county, local, right? And the federal prison system, there's multiple tiers within that system, right? In terms of security access. You have medical prisons, you have high security, max security, supermax, so on and so forth, right? And all of those have different guidelines for how they work. But then at each institution, how those guidelines are interpreted is up to the singular warden. And they can do whatever it is that they feel necessary that they deem necessary for the security of the institution. Right? So they can ban books completely from an institution. Right? Now you don't have to challenge that through court, but they can do it for a time period, right? And then the warden's dictates and the federal guidelines are then interpreted by who's ever working in the mill, right? So they're the arbiters of what they deem pornography, for example, right? So an advertisement for adult diapers in a magazine can be deemed pornographic and has been. And then that magazine's been banned, right? So we have the federal prison system, and it's like that. And then you have the state prison system. But it's not the state prison system, it's each state's prison system. And there's multiple tiers of those. And the same theory applies to those, right? The warden of each institution can arbitrarily decide things in terms of security, and then again to the mailroom, who's ever working in the mailroom that day, and then you get down to the county institutions, and we're not even talking about the military prisons, we're not even talking about ICE, right? These are whole other jurisdictions. But there's over 6,000 institutions of incarceration in this country. So each one has what you might call capricious and arbitrary rules, right? That you have to understand and find out each one. And they can change. They don't have to notify you that the rules and regulations change. In fact, they often don't. They just refuse the package, you get returned the package, and then you have to take the next measure to figure out why that package was banned, right? The burden is on you. So these are some of the difficulties, and I should state, right from the get-go, that individuals cannot send, right? If you have a loved one who's incarcerated, you can't send a book directly to them. You have to do it via an institution that is approved. And usually what that means is a brick and mortar bookstore or, one of the big corporate conglomerates. But even those, how that gets defined, what is an approved institution, often is challenged, and sometimes prison books programs are deemed unapproved for whatever reasons, and then you have to figure out why it is that institution. I've had it happen to one of the organizations I worked with, and they said, well, they looked us up online, and we weren't brick and mortar, so we weren't allowed in. I said, well, we run under this bookstore, look it up, that's what the return address is, so on and so forth. Had this long conversation with the person in the mailroom. And, this was one of the luckier ones and one of the easier conversations. But so then they just Googled it, found it, and they were like, oh, okay, you're approved now. Now it could be that easy, or no one may answer the phone, right? And it starts there. But do you want to talk about some of the other specifics that you've encountered?
Yeah, that sums it up really well. We spend a lot of time on the phone trying to talk to people and figure out why a package was returned. Some of the more broad, common restrictions are many facilities, like Angola in Louisiana, for example, only allow brand new books. Many institutions don't allow maps. No one allows hardcover books. Even, by the way, when I say no maps, I mean it can't even be like a Tolkien map. No maps. Several facilities lately have stopped allowing journals or notebooks because it's too much paper. There's just so many, the entire state of Arkansas sent us back lots of packages recently because now they have restrictions on how big the books can be. So many of the rules are just arbitrary and punitive.
And then that also requires you to then train all your volunteers on the new rules for each facility, or hang signage that says this facility only does that. So if you get a letter from there. And I'm glad you touched, Mac, on banning books, right? Because that's another thing that's come up a lot recently, is this movement to ban books, especially around LGBTQ people or Black and brown people. So many books are being banned across the U.S., not just in schools and libraries, but also in carceral facilities. So I was wondering if you guys have seen an uptick of those kinds of rules in carceral facilities, and also if there's any handy-dandy way to know what book has been banned, either in a state or a facility.
In Louisiana, there's not any handy-dandy way for sure. They are pretty careful not to put things in writing. Like Max said, we'll frequently just get a package returned to us that just says refused. Because if you don't put in writing why it's refused, it's a lot easier to keep just refusing it without any repercussions.
So there has been some work recently to kind of figure out exactly what books are banned and what the rationale for banning those books are. And there's recently been the establishment of Prison Banned Books Week, right, where people are trying to raise the awareness of what books are banned on the inside and why. And PEN America was involved in a lot of freedom of Information Act requests and doing a lot of research to kind of compile a list of all the banned books at federal institutions. But the problem is it's going back through all that myriad of institutions and each individual institution and getting participation from those institutions to acknowledge what the lists are. Many states have actual lists of books, but getting those lists from those states is difficult. And then even the reality is even if we were to ascertain what all of the books are on that list, it could change the day after, right? They could add 500 more books. But yes, we have seen an uptick in banned books, and there's a movement by many facilities now to ban books entirely, as tablets kind of begin to gain more access, or there's a push to make tablets more accessible in institutions. And I'll say this about tablets, many programs are not opposed to tablets being available to people on the inside, right? There's many good things about those tablets. However, they should not come at the expense. It doesn't have to be either or, it shouldn't be either. It should be tablets and books, right? And because the problem with the tablets is, sometimes they're free, sometimes they're not. Sometimes, you have to pay for the amount of time that you're on the tablet. The books, you have to pay for individual books, even though they may be available free through the Gutenberg project. There's lots of problems with what books are available on the tablets. And then if the book isn't available on the tablet and the institution has banned books in general because they're arguing that the tablets have replaced the need for them, then you're only getting what the state allows you to get. Right? And so that's probably the singular largest form of censorship that we're facing at this point in time.
Thank you. And I believe Prison Banned Books Week is the second to last week in September. Yes?
Yeah, it just happened. Yeah.
Right, because it's before sort of the bigger general Banned Books Week, which is always the last week in September. So all of y'all in the audience can be looking for that. PEN America does a really good job of posting things about Prison Banned Books Week during that time, and there's tons of resources and information, so you can check that out. But speaking of tons of resources and information, this book, y'all, I felt like I knew this work, and then I read it and realized how little I knew about this work. So I was wondering, Mac, if you could talk to me a little bit about how this book came together and why you guys decided to put it together in the first place.
Great question. So I was living in Saxapahaw, North Carolina, and we decided, Moira and I decided to start a new prison books program in Saxapahaw, North Carolina. And I think this tells you a lot about personalities. We said, well, what's the toughest state to get books in? We'll take that one. And to our mind, it was Georgia. So we decided that we would serve, because there were already, through the success of Asheville Prison Books and other programs in North Carolina, there was already, I think at that time, 3 or 4 other programs in the state of North Carolina. Is probably with the state with the most amount of prison books programs, oddly enough. And so we decided to start Saxapahaw Prison Books and focus on serving the needs of incarcerated people in Georgia. And an editor from UGA Press reached out and said, saw that y'all are doing this, and being the largest publisher in the state of Georgia, it seems like we could have some sort of partnership. Like, how could we help? What is it that we could do? And, one of the obvious first answers was books, but then we thought about it a little more, and we realized that, well, one of the big problems that many of these prison books programs face is that people don't necessarily know we exist, and the general public has no idea how difficult it is to obtain reading material behind bars. And whenever we talk about this to the general public, people are really surprised at all the things that we have to say. And so we quickly realized that maybe the thing that we needed to do was to write a book. And the editor at UGA Press was like, great idea, I love it, let's do it. And but we wanted to keep the ethos of the national movement as part of the book, right? We didn't want to necessarily be the arbiter of all of these stories. We wanted people to be able to tell their own experiences, right? And be able to narrate these experiences in their own fashion. And we knew that the voices of formerly incarcerated people were also going to be key to this, right? And even currently incarcerated people. We knew that those voices had to be included. So we just began reaching out to people that we had contacts with, reaching out to different prison books programs, asking people who wanted to tell their stories. And keep in mind, we're asking people who already have, right? These programs are generally run by people who are volunteers, and these are generally already poor working class people, right? And so who are already donating as much of their time to this other volunteer thing, and now we're asking if they want to do another thing, right? So even though people may have wanted to participate, it wasn't always easy to, for people to find the time to be able to do so, right? And then some people find writing really daunting and become intimidated when you say that this is going to be published in a book. They're like, no, not me. And we understand that, so we had to work to get people to find those voices and who could be able to articulate certain aspects of what was happening within the national movement. And luckily, it all came together. I feel like we got some really good stories, and the one that I'm personally the most proud of is the interview with Lorenzo Coma-Urban, because it really gave us some of that early history. And he had spent time with Martin Sostry, who was Martin Sostry when he was incarcerated in New York City awaiting trial. And it was Martin Sostry's lawsuit when Martin Sostry was in Attica that allowed books to become available in prisons in the first place. He was challenging the law and filed a lawsuit because he wanted the Quran. In many prisons at this time, the only book that was available was the Bible. That was it. Right? That was the only book you could get on the inside. And Sostry challenged it because he wanted access to the Quran. And he won that challenge, but that challenge also opened the door to lots of other books. And institutions, federal, state, and local, spent a lot of time catching up with these lawsuits, right? The lawsuits were ahead of the game. And there was a moment where lots of books were allowed inside, and lots of programs were established with help from people on the outside. But what Lorenzo Coma-Urban wanted to make clear in that chapter, and what I hope it did make clear, was that this was a movement that in many ways was started by people on the inside, right? There's people on the inside that drove this movement, right? And yes, they needed help on the outside, but it was them themselves that made this happen.
And I got to see him speak with you on a panel in March or April, whenever we met for the first time. And he really did talk about how he laid down his life. Like, he was threatened pretty severely for this idea that he had the right to read, and so did everyone else. So he says, I put my life on the line so that everyone inside could read. And it's a really powerful chapter. Thinking about what it is to read on the inside, and the fact that you included all these formerly incarcerated voices, currently incarcerated voices, in the book you also have actual copies of letters, and you have artwork from folks who have sent these letters, because there are drawings in a lot of them, and they're really beautiful drawings in a lot of these letters. Can you tell me why those examples were so important for this book? And maybe, Kelly, you can talk about the artwork a little bit, because I know you guys have a lot of it on the wall at Louisiana Books Prisoners.
So it's, for us, art is part of the movement, right? Is a part of many social movements. And, this is part of how people express themselves, right? And we have many people, many volunteers and whatnot. One of the things that we wanted to make clear was that in the prison books movement, there's a place for everybody. It doesn't matter what your skill. We'll find something for you to do that is helpful and that you feel good about doing, right? And that thing, maybe one person's thing is, hey, listen, I don't have a lot of time. I can't come to your work days, but I'm a really good graphic artist and I can make you some flyers. And we'll say, thank you very much. You're hired for zero compensation. right? And so that's one of the ways, and then we get art from, that's one of the, we get art back from people who are incarcerated. And that's, we want to show the humanity, we want that to kind of come through in the book. And so, incorporating all of that art was really important to us, and kind of to show the breadth and in many ways, the way to find joy in moments when everything else is kind of forcing you or driving you to a moment when you might, cry in despair, right? And art can help us through those moments. So that's part of the reason why I'm excited to talk about it.
And so much of what art is so resourceful. People will send just these gorgeous drawings that are, held together with medical tape on the back of some receipt, like just whatever's available. And we just have binders and binders of letters and art that people have sent to us, just trying to express gratitude and trying to share that connection that we often feel with each other, just simply through the exchange of letters and books. And so, yeah, I'm just always really struck by the sheer beauty that people can make when I feel like I'm not able to do that, or I'm in a similar situation.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask about 2020. Because Victoria Law also points out in her chapter how much more restrictive it got to send books in during the global pandemic, and also how much more necessary it was. And I can speak to this personally. I pulled up to give some books to the juvenile jail here in New Orleans, and I was told that social distancing inside for them meant lockdown. So they were in their cells reading 23 hours a day because that's all they had to do. And that's how the next week I pulled up with 500 more books that were donated by different bookstores around the city. And I know that Kelli had impacted y'all's work because you were in the basement of a healthcare worker at the time. So can you guys talk a little bit about what that looked like for your organizations and how you've seen those impacts continue?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, our whole operation was in the basement of 2 healthcare workers, and so it just made the actual day-to-day functions have to shift dramatically, and they've shifted since then. Like almost everything about our organization had to change as a result of the pandemic, and then to see our group at our monthly meeting was talking about this recently, just seeing the letters, like reading the letters that people were writing in the midst of the deepest part of the pandemic were so eye-opening, because as scary and as bad as it was on the outside, it was just so much worse on the inside. People were saying, like, we can't get a lot of information. We are not able to quarantine from each other. We're trying to fashion masks out of whatever we can find. Just the fear and anxiety that people were expressing was really intense. And like you said, books just became that much more important because lots of facilities were going on lockdown. Lots of people were even more restricted than they had been before.
Yeah, and that sense of desperation definitely, came through in the letters. But I will say, I'll take this moment to say that isolation is not necessarily the new thing that we confront at any given moment. Between, there's no real calculations, but as best we have been able to ascertain, between 80 and 100,000 people in the U.S. carceral system are in solitary confinement at any given time, which means it varies from place to place, but generally speaking, it means 23 hours in a cell per day with no human contact. But this was different, right? right? And the fear in general public was different, and it meant that everyone was locked in. It meant that some institutions just began refusing with all materials from the outside, right? And so it meant that even if you couldn't even get books in, even if you wanted to an institution that normally would accept your materials, right? And so it was definitely a dire time, and something that we all need to keep in mind, people who are incarcerated when things like this come around, because, you know, like, for instance, you know, when there's storms, right, during hurricanes, you know, this is something not to be worried about. What institutions are evacuating and what ones aren't, and who is aware of that, and where are they going, right? And so, you know, again, these are voices and people that we are meant to forget about. And as institutions, we refuse to accept that, and we refuse to forget.
So I've heard a lot of folks characterize the prison books movement, sort of the national one, as an abolitionist movement. And I was wondering if you guys agree with that characterization and if you'd speak to it a little bit.
So I'd say that many volunteers are abolitionists, but most organizations don't identify as abolitionist organizations. So in other words, this is what we do till there are no more prisons. That we're fulfilling the service, but our eyes are ultimately on the prize for many of us, which is the end of the carceral state, right? But this, in the meantime, there are almost 2 million people incarcerated in the United States. That's the last estimates that I was working. It's about 2 million at any given time incarcerated in the United States. So in the meantime, those people have to be served and remembered on the outside. And so, yeah, just to take that moment to say that abolition is a part of the movement, and you will find many volunteers, there's a lot of crossover, and you will find many organizations supporting abolitionist causes. But at the end of the day, I think that many people in the movement, each prison books program, you know, that's a decision that each individual program makes.
Yeah, and I'll say too, from the many different volunteers that come to a given work night or a work shift at all the different organizations, it is people of so many different backgrounds, so many different beliefs, so many different demographics, and it is just astounding to me how many people who would not get along, perhaps outside of this particular situation, can agree that people on the inside deserve something to read. And that's just such a base core belief, like you said, for those of us who are working toward abolition. In the meantime, it's, you can give someone a tangible thing that while you're in the midst of all these systems that feel so big and that feel so, you know, permanent, you can give someone a tangible thing to make that day better, right? It's like a small concrete act.
And I'll say this, and I think that this crowd is probably very, very sympathetic, but the idea of using the term abolition for the carceral state, some folks have a hard time with it, and I'll say that there are many connections, right? And just to keep in mind very simply, right, that the 13th Amendment does not abolish slavery for incarcerated people, right? And this was on the ballot in Louisiana, just in 2023, correct? And it didn't pass to overturn that. Many states, and I think from what I recall, there was some complicated wording in there that made it unclear as to how that was going to be processed, but this is something that is happening in many states. Many states have movements right now to make sure that within state constitutions that they do ban slavery as punishment for a crime. So this is something that's happening at a state level. So these things are definitively connected. And then I can go on about the connections, but another one that is worth pointing out, and that is that many people think that things like the 3/5 compromise are a relic of the past, right? And that's what, populations, enslaved people were counted, 3 out of every 5 enslaved people were counted in terms of population to, create electoral districts, and this gave disproportionate power to slaveholders, right? Well, there's a similar thing that happens with incarceration. Many prisons are in rural areas, and many people who are incarcerated are from more urban locations or different locations. It doesn't necessarily matter if they're shifted around the state. And so they're taken from one place and put in another where they count toward that population base in terms of that electoral district, right? And so they're giving disproportionate power. They're taken without, against their will, from one location to another where they add to that electoral district's total numbers, right? So there's a myriad of connections, and these are just some.
And where, though their population counts, their vote doesn't.
Yes.
Right?
There's actually a really incredible exhibit. Mac, while you're visiting, I encourage you to run down to the Historic New Orleans collection. They have an exhibit right now called Captive State, Louisiana and the Making of Mass Incarceration that really does a great job connecting those dots that you're pointing out between enslavement and how we got to where we are now, where we incarcerate the most people of any nation in the world.
And it's not even close.
No, it's not even close. It's like us and the next one. And they put that on a graph on the wall at this exhibit, and just the visual is startling to see. Startling is a really interesting word for something I tell people, and they are always surprised. I tell people all the time, the most requested book inside is a dictionary, and folks are shocked by that. It makes sense to me because I've read the letter. I can't understand my court paper. Please send me the dictionary so that I can better assist in my own defense. That's essentially the summary of this letter that I read time and time again, asking for a dictionary. But it is also the thing that folks are most surprised about. So when y'all are talking about this word, what's the thing that you find folks are most surprised about that they might not know?
It was surprising to me at first. I didn't know before I started doing this work that you couldn't just get books from loved ones if you're locked up. Like, I didn't even understand the concept of why prison books groups are necessary. Like you said, like if my brother is incarcerated, I can't just send him a book. It has to come from, Barnes & Noble or something like that. And so that really shocks people.
Yeah, I would, to point out about the dictionary as well, it's worth also thinking about how the highest estimates that I've seen are about 60% of incarcerated people are functionally illiterate. And so functional literacy, right, means that somebody can read the words on the page, but they don't necessarily understand them to articulate what they have just read becomes a problem, right? So they can go through the process of saying the words, but understanding the words and comprehending, because it's not the same thing as reading, right? And so that's one of the reasons why dictionaries are so necessary, and also points to why defunding of the education system has also been such a problem. But those aside, I would say that is also what Kelly just referenced is also one of the responses that I've had to the book as well. Is people are shocked that not just that they couldn't send books in, but they assumed, right, they've seen the movies. And they're like, but isn't there a library in the institution? Well, not all institutions, they're not required to have one. And then the state of that library really depends upon the institution, right? Some are, so first of all, as I said, not every institution has one. And then the ones that do, it really, runs the gamut of what books are in there and what the condition is. And commonly, you'll get letters, you know, from people who say, hey, I was reading X book, but the last chapter is gone. You know, any passages with vivid sex scenes, those pages will definitively be ripped out of the book in the library. You know, or whole chapters, or, you know, what have you. And so, you know, people don't necessarily get the entire book, and there's censorship over what books are on the shelves in those institutions. Sometimes, as Dan McGowan describes in the book, you know, he was in institutions where they just come by with a cart, and he said, you know, sometimes he was in institutions where, yes, there's a book cart that they bring by, and that they were curated, those books were curated, or they were grabbed off the shelf, whatever. But somebody pushes a cart, he said, but at one institution, he couldn't even see outside. He could only put his hand through, and he couldn't see the books. So he's just literally grabbing books like this. No idea what he's going to get, right? And that's the state of, you know, the material that's provided or not provided on the inside. I think a lot of people found that shocking. They're like, wait, I've seen the movie where there's a library, and I've seen the movie with the book cart. And it's like, well, you do understand those are movies, correct?
Yeah, and sort of speak to that point, I got an email the other day that said that jail in St. John the Baptist Parish has 0 books inside. Absolutely 0. So we're going to build them a micro library. They only want 25, but we're going to do it. So there will be books by December 30th. And it's also really interesting that you said the statistic about 60+% of the population being functionally illiterate. You had to quote a federal statistic. And to sort of point that out, the reason he had to quote a federal statistic is because data from states on their populations and how many folks are functionally illiterate is virtually non-existent. I was doing a talk a few years ago and I could not find that data for the state of Louisiana. So it's also just this idea of the fact that some states don't feel it necessary to even gauge who can read, much less what they want to read. We're running toward our time, but I want to bring it back to something that y'all have kind of reiterated over and over again. And that's that you guys and a lot of the folks who do this work have day jobs. You've been in this movement since the 90s, you've been in this movement since the early, mid-2000s, and you keep coming back. You were getting a PhD, you're an educator full-time. Most of the folks who do this are also full-time employees somewhere for someone working for a paycheck. This is not their gig. So there must be something that keeps folks coming back. For you guys, what keeps the two of you coming back to this work after all these years?
It's a population that just, we can't forget it all, and no one else, we don't do it who will. And I think that's, for me, that's one of the drives. It's just that it has to be done. People are falling through the cracks, and, you know, again, I came into this through my support for political prisoners, and then realizing that in an unjust system, all prisoners are political, right? And so I just can't turn my back on those folks. So that's what keeps me coming back. And there is a reward that you get. I mean, it's not all just give, right? Those letters that you get, I mean, you know, especially the letters that you get where people are just, you know, oh my God, thank you so much for sending me this material. This is, you know, I haven't received a letter in 3 years. And I didn't even know if your program is still in existence or how long it would take. And, you know, no, I didn't get the book I wanted. But it turned out that the book that you sent was really great, and, you know, here's why. And, I mean, those letters are, it's gold. It's gold.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about, y'all know that old story about the person throwing the starfish back on the beach? It's like a guy, there's just starfish everywhere on the beach, and one guy's just like tossing it back in the water. There's thousands of them. Another guy's like, what are you doing? You will never get all these starfish back on the beach. You're not helping them all. And he's like, help that one. And he just keeps going. And to me, it kind of feels that way of like you said, you know, lots of people feel really lonely and really forgotten about, and it's just one tangible thing you can do that's in some ways so easy, in other ways not. But sometimes, like when things are just feeling really overwhelming, it's like, you know what, I can do something for this person today, you know.
So we are now at time. I will say that if you want to learn more about the Louisiana Books to Prisoners organization, Kelli is here, and I believe 2 other people from Louisiana Books to Prisoners are here as well. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to talk to you about everything they do and invite you to a work night. And if you want to know more about this movement on the national level, get this book. It is available at Tubby and Coos. I'm sure Mac will sign it, and also answer questions. So we can reconvene in the lobby. I was going to say adjourn and reconvene at the same time. It didn't work. We can adjourn to the lobby and reconvene in small groups. Can y'all thank Mac and Kelli for me for a minute? And this concludes the first full day of Words of Music 2024. We hope to see you right back here tomorrow for an incredible day. The penultimate session tomorrow is actually a group of poets responding to that exhibit at the HNOC. I saw one of the poems, guys. It's going to be amazing. So come out, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.